plowing and running a rod, we started finding earthworms. And growing up, I don't think I ever found a single earthworm. I thought earthworms were something that Andy and Opie found before they went fishing. You know, you'd see on these old shows, they'd go dig up some worms. And I thought, well, that's for other places. But what's really amazing is once we quit plowing, is how quickly the worms showed back up, which to me is always a good indicator of better soil health. Mainly because we're not tearing up its house all the time, running a plow through it. But it's not an exaggeration now that when we're digging behind the planter, we find way more earthworms in a foot of seed trench than we find cottonseed. But part of that is because I've cut my cottonseed rate back. But it's not unheard of in a foot of seed trench to find 5 or 6 earthworms. And it's just amazing. That's just one small part of the field. To think about that those things are out there working all the time, on my behalf. Recycling trash on the top of the ground, creating channels, and turning things into fertilizer. So, just a quick overview of what our stuff, kind of the way we do it. As soon as we get the cotton stripper run through the field, we're in there trying to plant a cereal as quickly as we can, rye, wheat, triticale, something like that. Just so we can take advantage of, hopefully, maybe we've had a little bit of fall moisture and we can plant directly into that, and also try to get in as soon as we can before, it gets cold. Everybody knows that cotton farmers don't make good wheat farmers, but it's mainly because, we get the crop out too late most of the time. Planting wheat in December doesn't make for a bumper crop the next year, and so we just leave the stalk standing and run a drill straight through it. And then after that, we're generally looking, if we can harvest the rye, we'll harvest it. If not, then we just leave it out there standing. And we used to do a little bit more work with some warm season grasses, and we still do some, mainly some millets, if we need to supplement some cover. If the rye behind the cotton wasn't enough cover, and this ground will lay out. All my stuff is, for the most part, is half and half, dry land pivots, and so we have a year time period to try to grow a cover crop sometime in that year. And that goes back to the picture I showed earlier between my neighbor and myself, is hopefully sometime in that calendar year, we're gonna gather enough rainfall and be ready with something, whether it's more of a fall cover like rye and radish, or maybe it's a midsummer cover if we think we might get enough then to plant something like millet, a warm season grass. But you kind of got to be ready based on the forecast of when you think you might get the precipitation and take advantage of that, because we don't water any of our covers up. They're strictly rain fed. And so then we go to planting radish into this, or this year was rye and radish. Mainly just use the rye kind of as a carrier. I planted 10 pounds of rye because when you're planting 2 pounds of radish, it's hard to squeeze a drill down that low. And that's 2 pounds of radish, and I think I could have planted 1 or 1.5. 2 pounds of radish is a lot of radish. And this is that same picture taken on October 22nd. And this is that same field on January 10th. You can see we had a good hard freeze right before Christmas that killed all my radish, and just left what little bit of rye that I had out there. And so I'm very pleased with the way this looks, considering that in the time period, as I said earlier, from October and really even to January, we're talking, going on over a year, 13, 14 months with very limited rainfall. We had a little bit through the fall, enough to kind of get rye and stuff germinated, but it wasn't no great amount to put any kind of moisture deep. It wasn't 2 or 3 inches at a time. It was 3 or 4 tenths here and there. And so to be able to grow this on that amount of precipitation in a year, I was really pleased with. And hopefully we'll be able to catch some rain before we need to be planting our next cash crop, whatever that is, whether it's a grain or cotton. We're ready to, we've got some armor in the soil to slow down a good heavy rain and hopefully be able to infiltrate as much as we possibly can. Okay, so wide row cotton. We've been playing with it a little bit the past 3 or 4 years. All our stuff is on 80s. Since we're 40-inch spacing, we're on 80s. Our wide row cotton is on 80s. So essentially when we started, and from a plant population standpoint, I always get asked, we just started with just basically turning every other row off is how we got started. And we're kind of working our population down from there, is how we started doing it. But where cotton is we're in a unique position as cotton farmers, where it is an indeterminate plant. and it's able to take advantage of wider spacings, and it's not like a much more determinate crop like corn or milo or something that has some flex on the head or the ear, but a corn plant's essentially going to produce an ear is what it's going to produce, and then that plant's going to die and senesce and go down. A cotton plant, it thinks it's going to be here next year. You know, it's an indeterminate perennial, and so we treat it like an annual, but cotton is so much that I don't think we're taking advantage of. And every producer in here knows we all grew up, or we've all seen these plants on the end of the row, you know, and it's not uncommon to find one by itself, and it's got 150 or 200 good mature bolls on it. And I always thought, my mindset is, I need to grow a field of those, because I go to my row where I've planted 35,000 plants and pull a plant up, and it's kind of anemic and sorry looking, and it's got 8 bolls on it. And I'm like, I need to get to one that has 150 is what I need to get to, or a lot more positions. And so this is the closest we found, is work in that direction of trying to let that plant express a little bit more of that indeterminateness, and take advantage of that. And it's also, when you go to planting less cotton, you know, if you think of a cotton plant as a factory that produces, which essentially is that produces fiber and seed. Well, when you think of any factory or whether it's a business or whatever, everything's got a startup cost, you know. But if your factory had the ability to produce an infinite amount of goods, why would we build 2 or 3 factories next to each other? And so by having so many less plants out there, I think of it as the startup cost is a lot less. That's how we can get away with 60, or, you know, if you visit Australians, they're more like 80% nitrogen reduction. It's because we're not having to grow a bunch of extra stems and a bunch of extra leaves, you know, to produce 6 bolls on it. We can take that one plant and it can do it, and build a massive root system so that it is more nitrogen, more nutrient efficient, and more water efficient. When we have all these plants out there, that cotton plant isn't going to go over and encroach a bunch on its neighbor's root space, because it knows it's not worth investing the carbohydrates to do that. But if you give that cotton plant space, it will take up that space. It will meet in the middle. On my 80s, you can dig in the middle of an 80-inch row and there's cotton roots in the middle of it. And so cotton will go down and find and seek what it wants if you give it the space to do it. And so by building this massive root system, that's how we can become so much more water and nutrient efficient. And you can kind of see here, there's a little bit of an example or a picture. You can see it's kind of hard to see the leaves on it, but just from a traditional plant, you know, compared to a traditional plant, how many more positions, you know, one in an 80-inch row has to it. And I will say this, that I'm far from having everything figured out on 80-inch cotton. I don't want anybody to think that. There's something I learn every year. The biggest thing, my biggest takeaway this year, I would say, from any sort of wide row cotton production is the need to start with a moisture soil, ideally, if we can, a full profile. And then you say, well, yeah, Kris, no duh, we'd always like to start with a full profile on everything. But I think as cotton producers, we have this mindset of, I want to do something to help it, because I know I do. Come June 20th, we're out of the hail season, and I think, I got to start watering this cotton. That's what I need to do. Because generally about that time, it's kind of been beat up by whether it's thrips or wind, and you're wanting that cotton plant to grow. But that's really not in its nature if we think about a perennial plant. A perennial plant wants to develop its massive root system first, is what it wants to do. It's not like an annual like corn that puts on a little root system and then goes to town and goes to growing above ground. And so I think this is twofold is my main takeaway from this year, whether it's on 40s or 80s, is we need to try to start with as much of a profile as we can, because those roots aren't going to grow into dry dirt. And so if you have some moisture for those roots to go into, number one, as the ground dries out, that cotton roots go out and chase that moisture and builds a big root system. Because if you don't build that root system, then you've just got every other row of 40-inch plants that you planted on 80-inch centers is what you've done. And I've done plenty of that on my wide row stuff and my 40s. And guys in here who know, when we take whether it's any planter, we have examples of a pivot that we can go to that we say, man, it's got plenty of water and, you know, it's standing in water, but this cotton's still getting hot. Well, I think it's because we go in there and we make a drug addict out of these cotton plants in June and think, I'm gonna go put some fertilizer and water on it. And all we've done is Once that cotton plant had some water from the top, it was growing a root system. Now you start giving it a bunch. Now it's thinking, why do I need to build any more roots? This guy's giving me all that I need right here. And while that cotton plant is this big and has no load on it, that works good. But come August, when it's got a big bowl load on it and it didn't have the root system to support it, then it goes to throwing stuff off. And so my main takeaway from this year is we got to start with a profile and we got to delay irrigation. And I know I've got plenty of low water or big humidifiers is kind of what I like to think of them as. They're not really even low water. It's as low as a pivot can be nozzled, and I don't want to start, I think we need to be pushing our water date back is what I'm saying. I waited until 1st of July this year, and I think I should have waited till the middle of July. And I know it seems counterintuitive of I've got to get some water on this, but we can't build a profile once we've already put a cotton plant in the ground. The time to build a profile is maybe from pre-watering, and you spend a little bit of money there, and you push your start of irrigation back even further. Because once you build that root system under this, I had one field that I think I did halfway right, and it wasn't on my own. It's just because my water was so low, it took that pivot like 2 weeks to make a circle. And so it delayed my water start time even another 2 weeks. And that wide row cotton looked behind, and I thought it was never going to do anything, but it built a lot bigger root system than the rest of my cotton plants. And then once it started blooming, it started doing it all at once. And it caught up to my field that was next to it that's always seemed 2 weeks ahead. And so we've got to build a root system and an engine underneath these cotton plants, whether it's 40s or 80s or 60s, whatever it is, but it's especially important on wide row. I would say is my main takeaway from this year. And this is just a picture here that I have. I just had to stick in there. It's from 2 years ago with some dryland cotton. None of my dryland looked like this year, and probably won't for a while, but this stuff here made, on this dryland, made 2 bales to the land acre, and so 4 bales to the row is what it made on dryland. And that was better than, by about 150 pounds than any of my 40-inch stuff that made real close, but it's absolutely fantastic dryland. That's better than most of my irrigated on a bunch of it this year. And if you want to hear some people that know way more about this than I do, I encourage you to come to the no-till meeting in February 14th and 15th. It'll be here at the Overton. You can check out the website. But there's lots of guys who are doing a lot of dry land, wide row stuff, and some guys who've been doing some irrigated stuff a lot longer than I have. And so cover crops, things like that. It should be a really good meeting. I encourage all y'all to check it out if you're interested. And I'll be happy to try to answer any questions if anybody's got any.
You're listening to live coverage of the 2023 Texas Alliance for Water Conservation.
Rick's asking how many pounds of total end we put on. It kind of varies, and we're still playing around, but my wide row this year got anywhere from 20 to 50 units is what it got. And I would say the 20 unit stuff was on my lower, irrigated cotton. And my 80s ranged anywhere from, total anywhere from 800 pounds to the land acre this year to about 3 to the land acre. And that was the 50 unit stuff. But I'm not saying we still can't tail that back a little bit. I mean, you look at that 4 bale or that 2 bale dry land that I had, had like 25 to 30 units on it is what it had. And so I think a lot of it's functional water and nitrogen, but we're able to pare nitrogen way back on this stuff. And we're still having to pix it a good bit too, which tells me I don't think we're getting too short on nitrogen because we're still trying to keep it compact and under control. But we're anywhere from the 20 to 50 unit range on all of our cotton. We're putting a little bit of phosphorus in through a seed trench at planting. We're doing a little bit of that with some other micronutrients, but not just a ton of phosphorus in the past few years, really. Yes, sir.
Really informative talk. Are you all doing any grazing or harvesting of your cover crops?
We're doing any harvesting of the cover crops or grazing. that's kind of really just based on, the year. I was hoping to do a little bit more of this rye and radish this year, but since the winters turned out so dry, I'm kind of glad that I hadn't. I probably would have planted more than 10 pounds of rye if I could in hopes to graze something, but I really didn't have enough rye, so I ended up on 10 pounds. But 10 pounds isn't great for grazing, but also not having any rain in the fall and the spring isn't great for grazing either. And so we kind of do it as opportunity provides. If we have a big year, we might try to bale or graze them. Ideally, we like to graze it rather than bale it, but depending on how close we are needing to plant, kind of determines some of that. But yes, sir, we try to do as opportunity presents itself, but as I said, we're not spending any money irrigating any of these covers. We're kind of at the whim of the good Lord and the rain, so.
What varieties of cotton did you plant for this? Because I know some varieties bush out more, and some are more.
Yes, sir. That's another good, it's a question is trying to figure out, and it's not like variety trials list. This was on 80 or 90 inch spacing, and we look at, a lot of that, but you're right. There are finding your own variety. These ones that I had here, I had fiber max 1621 and 2498 is what I had this year, and my 2498 did better. And I never would have thought that. The 2498 seemed a little bit more upright than the 1621, but the 1621, mainly from a leaf standpoint, kind of bit me this year. But you're correct, trying to find a plant that wants to maybe not get as tall, seems like, and some plants want to put on more multiple positions. And that wasn't the 2498 this year, but it also still did better. So you kind of got to try some and see. And especially on any kind of irrigated wide row, you really got to start pixing early is also the key. On any kind of irrigated wide row cotton, it will get very tall and very vegetative if you let it. On my dry land, I was planting, that'd be 12,000 seed to the acre. That's as low as my planter will let me go. It was like 23 something, and then we just cut that in half. What
about on the irrigating?
On top of drip tape, I think, Darcy, I think we were at like 15,000 this year, 15 to 16,000 total, so we've been like 30 to 31. And then we cut that in half. Mm-hmm. He's asking on the row configuration where we're planting on pivots in relation to the drop. The Australians say it'd be ideal to plant north and south, but my ruts are too big of a problem, and I didn't like driving over them. I know that'd probably be better, but we're still planting our 80s in a circle. And I found that if you're going to do them in a circle on a pivot, the easiest place to do it is just still keep it in the top of the old bed. You can pick whichever bed you want, but that way, you're 20 inches off to the side of where your drop is. I don't think you want to plant in the soft middle, because then you have that drop dragging through your cotton all year long. I've had it pull tips off, turn if you've got a cutoff valve on it, cuts those off or turns them on. And so you'd like that drop to be out to the side of it, as much as you can, ideally. I also messed up one year and planted in my hard middles, and that's no good either. It gets your water as far away from your cotton plant as you can, which is good. At least it seems like it makes that cotton root go out there and get that water. But it's about a 300 or 400 pound penalty for planting in the hard row, I think, just because it was so hard from all the years of driving on it. I think we had a lot of compaction in it. So we're planting in the top of the old beds on pivots. That's what we're doing. Yes, sir.
What's your herbicide program? Something like this with wide rows?
Mm-hmm.
Weed problems?
Our herbicide program is essentially the same. We didn't change any of that. I mean, the wide rows, I can't say gave us any more of a weed pressure problem. We were weedish. I mean, number one, in the past we've had pretty good ground cover. You don't have some mulch trying to cover the ground, and that helps. I found, since we've stopped plowing, our annual weed pressure isn't near as bad. Perennials and perennial grass is more of our issue now that we've stopped plowing, but essentially lots of residuals. We're putting, dual or directs behind the planter. We're spraying before that, spraying for winter weeds, but something like a white herbicide and paraquat behind the planter And then we're following that up with a early post application of like Roundup and Dual, and then running a hood where we can also in between the stuff. And we're still having to do some hoeing. All our stuff's Fibermax. And so we still have to do some run a buggy or do some hoeing every now and then. And so there's no silver bullet to all of this, but we're just lots of overlapping residuals. Yes, sir, in the back. Yeah, we're completely no-till. There's times I really want to. It would make, especially I've got a few fields, maybe 7, maybe at the most 10%. I've got some cotton on some drip, and volunteer is a real problem. And every year when I have to try to clean it up or have to look at it after harvest, I'm like, I need to start heeding my own words and rotate all of this. But it's difficult sometimes, landowners and other things such as that. But anyway, I'm not saying a light sweep would be the end of the world. I think the less tillage or more shallow you can do, it's better off. But even with running a sweep is difficult up next. You're still going to have some next to that row, where we run a hood or whatever. We still have some next to it. We can get most of it with a hood or even with a sweep. But the best thing I found for volunteer control is rotation. Yes, sir, Beckton.
The radish crop that you showed, do you have any trouble planting into that? Is it too good to run any guard off?
In the past, I'll have to look at it. Kind of depends on when they freeze and when they deteriorate. If they deteriorate early enough, and especially if we ever get some moisture after, it helps continue to deteriorate. I have had to run a stalk cutter is what I've done ahead of my planter, just to kind of knock the top out, so I'm not running over a radish carcass. Ideally, what I would do, and what I'm going to look into, is you potentially either plant your radishes with your row crop planter and plant them all in a line off to the side, and then you don't have to mess with them depending on when they freeze. You don't have to run a stalk cutter to kind of knock them out of the way, or I'd have a separate radish box is also what would be nice on the back of a drill, where you could plant your, essentially you could maybe plant your cereal and your radish in every other drop on your drill, and that way it'd give you a 20-inch gap between your radishes to run your planter down. Yes, that's exactly right. Just by moving them out of the way, I think it's the better way to do it. But I always have grand plans during the winter, and it comes around to August, and I got to get them planted or not have them, so we just throw them in the drill. But they hadn't really been too big of a problem so far, but I have had to run a stalk cutter ahead of it sometimes. Thank you all.
Thank you, Mr. Verett. That is certainly valuable information for all of us, as you can tell by the line of questioning you had there after your presentation. Our next presenter will be on the topic of opportunities for sorghum in climate-smart and water-smart agriculture. In August of 22, John Duff launched Soro Ag Strategies in terms of consultancy which bridges the gap between farmers and their supply chain partners. Mr. Duff is the author of Sorghum Focus, a monthly column that has a circulation of approximately 180,000 readers. Congratulations are in order out to Mr. Duff, as he was the recipient of the 2022 Davis College Outstanding Young Alumnus. He serves on the Chamber of Commerce, obviously demonstrates leadership in the area of agriculture, as he has demonstrated with these honors and awards. John Duff is here to present on behalf of national sorghum producers. Please join me in welcoming John Duff.
Man, it's hard to follow somebody who tells you how to grow two-bale dryland cotton. I want to listen to what he had to say more than what I want to listen to what I want to have to say. That's awesome. Thank you for that, Kris. I don't know where he's sitting. Appreciate that. I need to catch you after. That's really cool stuff. And as I think about my future, in farming, I think about I think it's going to look a lot different. I think it's going to look radically different. I think I'm going to be farming mostly from a computer screen 30 miles away from the farm, and I'm probably not going to put eyes on it every week, and certainly not going to put eyes on it every day. The Lord has had other plans for my life, and my future on the farm, I think, is just as bright and just as exciting, but it's going to look radically different. And I really appreciated Kris's comments on employees and employee burnout, and not having employees, not expecting employees to be out on Friday, Saturday, Sunday, 4 or 5 weekends in a row on the sand fighter, fighting sand behind a rain that you don't even get to reap the benefits of because it's all run off. I really appreciated those comments. It's something that I think about a whole lot as I look, again, forward at what the future of agriculture looks like. And I think a lot of that is not only trying to do more with less from a environmental resources perspective or an input perspective, but also trying to do more with less from a people perspective, and working really hard to make sure that we're optimizing the use of our time as a resource, not only optimizing the use of our nitrogen or our water or whatever, because we got families at home that desperately need to have more of our time than they have had in the past. But there's a number of things that need to change, I think, for my future and hopefully yours as well. And I think that sustainability goes hand in hand with family sustainability goes hand in hand, I think, with environmental sustainability. So a lot of cool nuggets in that presentation, Kris. Really appreciate that. Before I talk about myself, I want to say one more thing on sustainability. This word has been just terrifying to many in agriculture for a decade now or more. We have really, and myself included, really spent a lot of time and sleepless nights worrying about what sustainability is, what it does, what it means for our future, but I think it doesn't have to be scary, and it's not scary. And I think Kris's presentation really showed that. A lot of times when we think about sustainability today, we think about carbon, and we think about global warming, and we think about all these companies that are trying to tell the farm and the farmer how to farm and what to do and how to do it and what they're going to put down, what they're not going to put down. And that is scary, no doubt. But sustainability is way more than that, right? It's water. It's ag productivity. I was at a sustainability conference a few weeks ago, and some of the largest NGOs in the world who look and think and believe and feel radically different than we in this room do. We're at odds in a lot of cases politically, from a faith perspective, values, morals perspective. We're massively at odds. But those folks all agreed with the farmers there that the most important thing is ag productivity. So you didn't hear anything about global warming. You didn't hear anything about carbon or environmentalism or taking pesticides off the market. You heard ag productivity, because something we can all agree on. The most hardcore environmental group, who's an honest broker and is not just trying to create problems, at the end of the day, they want ag productivity because that means a lower environmental footprint. And everybody in this room wants more ag productivity as well. Nobody here came to figure out how to be less productive. They came here to figure out how to be more productive. And so I encourage you, as we think about sustainability, to think about how we can use the interest in sustainability and the funding in sustainability from multinational companies and use that and leverage that for more productivity. Your footprint will go down in the process, whether you want it to or not, or intended it to, and your profit will go up. And these environmental groups, again, provided they're honest brokers that aren't just out to destroy modern agriculture, they'll get what they want, and that's a lower footprint. You'll get more profit, they'll have what they want, and it's a win-win. So I encourage everybody to think about sustainability in that way. Okay, a little bit about me. I know a ton of you in this room, some of you may or may not have known about my change. It looks a whole lot different, but in practice, it's really not. In August, I became a contractor for National Sorghum Producers, where I had spent the last 11 years, really grew up professionally in that organization, started there at 22. But I had some really cool opportunities that I needed to be outside the office and have some flexibility in order to really take advantage of. And so I left on a Monday, and on a Tuesday I started Cerro Ag Strategies, which is a sustainability consultancy mainly that does a lot of the things that I was doing at sorghum. It really tries to figure out how you take opportunities for sorghum farmers, or you take what's going on the farm and you take what corporate America wants, and you marry those together and try to figure out how both sides benefit from that. Sorrow comes from the Latin verb to produce, to propagate, or to bring forth, and that's really what I'm trying to do every day. I'm trying to bring forth opportunities for sorghum and other farmers downstream in the supply chain and in the marketplace. So my claim to fame so far has been right after I left, we got awarded, sorghum got awarded a $65 million Climate Smart grant. Pretty big feather in your cap to get that for your biggest client a couple months after you start your own business. So that's mainly what I do is climate smart agriculture in the context of sorghum, including getting this grant off the ground. A little bit about the Climate Smart program. Of course, USDA announced the Climate Smart Partnerships program. They only made a 15-page requirement for the application, and surprise, surprise, they had 1 million people interested in this. There were 150 projects submitted from about that many groups, and the total amount submitted and asked for was $20 billion. Of course, everybody in this room should have submitted. It was only 15 pages. Of course, they got a lot of interest. At first, they were going to spend $1 billion, and by the time it was all over, they spent $3.5 billion on this program. There were two funding pools. There was the first pool is what we were in, and that was the big one. Those are up to $100 million, and then the second one was a smaller pool up to $5 million for more kind of technical and specialized sustainability things. Targeted a little less at the farmer and a little more towards research and kind of bleeding edge sustainability stuff. We were in the first pool, of course. We were awarded $65 million, asked for 68.7 and were awarded 65, which was actually one of the smallest cuts. So USDA really liked the ideas we had. TAWC's pool was the second pool, and they were also awarded. That was up to $5 million, and that award was almost $5 million. And so extremely exciting, the opportunities in climate smart agriculture that TAWC, Texas Tech, that folks in this room are going to be able to participate in over the coming years. There was a small component of ours, about $1 million of our big one, that was actually some work here at TAWC, and a lot of you, whether you know it yet or not, will be participating in some of those initiatives, and I think that's going to be really cool and provide a lot of opportunity for this area. And then, of course, the $5 million grant that's dedicated to TAWC, that will be cotton and sorghum rotations, figuring out how to optimize that, figuring out how to use technology, figuring out what the best practices are for rotating cotton and sorghum under limited irrigation. Our elevator pitch, really, it's pretty simple what we're proposing to do. There's some crazy complicated projects. Ours is pretty simple. Farmers are going to adopt climate smart practices. We're going to collect data at every step at an extremely granular level, down at the field level. Compensation for those practices is going to come at the end of the crop season. Don't hold me to it, but the average practice value is probably going to be somewhere around $50 per acre, and we're going to put an acreage cap of a $500 because we're going to oversubscribe this thing so quickly. We're going to have to hold the acreage cap down, otherwise 10 farmers are going to take everything immediately. So from a budget perspective, $65 million is the total budget. Of that, farmers are going to get $45 million. It's a 5-year grant, so it's about $9 million a year that'll go to farmers to compensate for climate smart practices. We're going to staff up. Many of y'all know sorghum's a small organization. It was a small organization. It's not anymore. 20 years ago, national sorghum producers sat down to 5 people. Things sucked in the industry. They still suck in the industry. This was the worst crop we've ever had in history. But things were really challenging in in the crop, and that was reflected in the organization. And there were 5 people wondering how they were going to keep the lights on. Today, depending on how you calculate it, we're about 25 people, and we're going to hire 10 to administer this grant. And so we're going to be a staff of almost 40 this time next year, and it's really exciting because that means for 5 years we're going to have 10 people, or 40% of our organization focused just on sustainability. The additional money in the budget is going to go to research, like here at Texas Tech. We'll do a little bit of nitrogen work at Kansas State and a couple other projects, a little breeding project at the Danforth Center in St. Louis, some other ag technology stuff down at Texas A&M, and then all the data collection. There will be a significant data collection operation to capture all the data at the field level for 5 years. It's going to be an incredible amount of data that is really unheard of in history as you look at collecting this type of information. The value of our practices, that $50 an acre value, it gets pretty complicated here, so stay with me. The number one sustainability market today is not indigo and their carbon market. It's the low carbon fuel standard in California. So any fuel that goes to California has to have a carbon score associated with it. And about half of the sorghum ethanol produced in the U.S. Goes to California. And so the carbon score, it ultimately indirectly flows back to the farmer through the ethanol plant. The way all those emissions are tracked, they don't care about carbon sequestered or what's going on under the soil. It's the life cycle emissions. So when your tractor goes across the field, what the emissions associated with that, those are all counted up. And so if you're to drive down the footprint on the farm by plowing less or by using less nitrogen or having a higher yield with less inputs, your associated carbon score of the fuel in California, assuming you make fuel out of the grain you produce on the farm, it has a value that drives down that carbon score. And that's how we're valuing that. We're valuing it like that because that's the most valuable market. That's $50 an acre. That's about what it is. For those of you that have looked at indigo, it might be $10 an acre. This is 50 because it is a market tied to a specific fuel emissions reduction goal in the state of California. I know what a lot of you are thinking. I hear this all the time. I hear, what happens if these markets go away? What happens if these markets don't pay this? What happens? Well, the fact is this is not going away. There are 66 markets globally, for better or worse. Not advocating for it here, but for better or worse, there are 66 markets across the U.S. or across the globe that have some kind of fuel standard that drives toward emission reductions of the fuel. And it was a fraction of that just a few years ago, and it was probably going to be double that 10 years from now. And so this is the direction, for better or worse, we've decided to go with our transportation. You're seeing that with electric vehicles. You see it with hydrogen. You see it with other sources of vehicle power. This is the direction we're moving. And so we're going to continue to see the fuel standards paying significantly more for sustainability practices than anybody paying for carbon sequestration in the soil. So that's why we are valuing our practices in that way. It lets us pay a lot more, frankly, than we would if we were tracked to another market. This is, again, don't hold me to this. This is a chart that generally overviews what the payment would be. Of course, somebody who's no-till on dry land and they're doing precision nitrogen management, looks like $54 an acre, give or take. And those irrigated practices, when you're looking at irrigation reduction, nitrogen reduction, and no-till, because the yield's so high, the payment's going to get larger. So you could see a payment of $100 an acre in some irrigated scenarios on that program. It's really boring. It's really technical, and so I'll stop there on Climate Smart and say a couple things about the future. What's really exciting to me is what we're going to do a year from now, and what we're going to do 2 years from now, what we're going to do 5 and 10 years from now, with this massive network that we're going to build and the data collection platform that we're going to build through Climate Smart. We are going to pitch at the end of the month an additional project on water that will be carried out on the Climate Smart farms and others, anybody who wants to participate, that will see additional water smart technologies adopted. And think beyond AdSense. Think autonomous pivot, autonomous drones, extremely granular satellite imagery that goes down to the sub-meter level to try to get to the bottom of problems in the field before they occur. Those are the kind of things that we're going to employ as a part of a water program in the future. And then hopefully build a water credit as a part of that will allow any water savings to be monetized out in the corporate world with companies that are worried about their water footprint. So that's what's coming next. Right after that is probably a bolt-on project on nitrogen management. Usually I have a picture of a dead fish washing up on the shore in these presentations for shock value because of nitrogen runoff and what that does in watersheds. And I didn't hear, but nitrogen runoff into watersheds and what that does to aquatic life is a real problem. Now, it's not all the farmers' fault. We're over-fertilizing our yards. We're over-fertilizing golf courses, to be sure. But you're going to get blamed for that. And the good thing is we don't have the problems in high plains like they have in Mississippi, like they have in Ohio, like they have in the Eastern Corn Belt. We don't have those same issues of nutrient runoff into watersheds that causes dead zones in bodies of water. And so the High Plains is going to have a distinct advantage of that and that will be the crux of what I hope is the next project after water in nitrogen management, and figuring out how we reduce nitrogen runoff and losses, but also demonstrate that it's just flat out not occurring on the High Plains and that we have a significant advantage in that area that frankly should be compensated in sustainability markets. So those are some of the projects that we have coming. It's really exciting. $65 million is really impressive, but it's going to be one giant pain in the butt if it stays $65 million. My vision is to turn that into $100 million, paid for by corporate America, paid for by private foundations, by USDA, to deploy additional technology that will allow us to do exactly what Kris is doing, and that's think radically different about the future of agriculture and make our lives better for it and make the environment better for it as well. If you're interested in participating, know that when you call me, I'm going to give you more questions back to you and more answers than questions back to you than answers to your questions, because we're still building this airplane and it is already in the air. And frankly, USDA is doing the same thing with this program. Like I said, 141 projects, $3.5 billion. It's a monster program with a lot of unknowns still, so bear with us in advance. Act quickly because we've got only about $9 million a year, and there's thousands of farmers in the U.S. that are already doing a lot of these practices and will easily be able to adopt and meet the requirements and will already be able to participate. And so act quickly. sorghumgrowers.com/climatesmart. Call me. My email address is up there. I'm pretty easy to get a hold of. I'm on every social media platform there is. Write for a couple of different magazines. Would love to visit with you. We've also got a booth out here, of course. Rick Kokenauer is an agronomist that we have hired to help manage this monster. He is one of the world's foremost experts on growing sorghum, and I know he would love to talk to you as well. So with that, I really appreciate it. I love this group. I love the cause. As a son of a small irrigated cotton farmer myself, and a future small irrigated cotton farmer running out of water myself, we've got real problems that we need to address, and this room and this conference and this organization and this university is addressing them. And that's cool, and that's cause to be really excited. So I appreciate that. Would love to answer any questions you have. Question is, why does California get to set the emissions penalty? They're California. That's an awesome question. California voters, for better or worse, have decided that clean air is a priority, and Sacramento has responded. They responded in 2008, I believe, maybe 2007, is when the enabling, authorizing legislation for the low carbon fuel standard was enacted. And they come with extremely aggressive emissions targets. And the only way they can meet those emissions targets is to use a lot of fuel like ethanol that has a radically lower carbon footprint than petroleum-based fuels. That's a great question, and it's one that a lot of folks in California don't know the answer to themselves, but a small number of lawmakers in Sacramento are listening to their constituencies that have a large influence and have made the decision that clean air is something that they should really worry about and use the very large stick that they have in the form of a large fuel market as a way to drive change in that area.
What are some of those 66 standard places that are listed globally?
What are some of the places? Okay, yeah, no, this is a great question too. Of course, there's developed countries, right, and developing. Europe has a standard. The U.S., Canada, Brazil, Colombia, Mexico, Japan, China has one. There are a number of countries that have these fuel standards at varying degrees of complexity and aggressiveness, right? In some cases, it's kind of a fluffy, maybe it's a tax credit or something. And in other cases, like in California, it's extremely well developed. It has carbon, it has very complex models that value the fuels. So varying degrees of complexity there. But interestingly enough, and I don't completely agree with this logic, but interestingly enough, there are a number of countries in sub-Saharan Africa that have fuel standards. I think they should be worried about, feeding themselves and not worried about fuel emissions. But that's where we are. And there's a number of countries in Africa that have decided that they need to worry about clean air as well. Personally, I find it pretty interesting and don't totally agree with that line of thinking, but they have, again, like California, decided that this is something they should worry about. Yes, ma'am.
Would you address using our precious water for fuel? I mean, basically, you're going to have to water your soil in most cases, right?
Yeah.
Do you not get that question from environmentalists about using our most precious resource for fuel?
Yeah, no, that's a great question. Question was using water for fuel. Is how is that okay? And the good thing about this is that the water balance on ethanol is actually better than the water balance on petroleum. When you look at the amount of the gallons per BTU, right? Because that's ultimately what this breaks down to, is gallons used of water per energy output. The gallons per BTU on a gallon of ethanol are actually lower than on a gallon of gasoline. And so just strictly from a water perspective, ethanol is actually improving in that area as well. Now, beyond that, 91% of sorghum in the U.S. is rain-fed. I'd say in the sorghum ethanol areas, it's probably 95%. And so we're not spending a whole lot of water on going to ethanol anyway. And then I'd say it's probably similar in corn. About 89% of the corn in the U.S. is rain-fed, and it's probably higher than that in the ethanol demand shed. That's a really good question. I'm glad you asked that, because that's an important point to be made when we're talking about renewable fuels. Yes, sir.
Hey, that was a great presentation, and I want to buy you a beverage sometime. But my group's from Amarillo, and we're working on similar problems, and we'd like to get our heads together. But I do have a question. With the beef and the dairy industry, basically pledging to go net carbon neutral in the future, right? And all the hard work you've already done. What type of leadership and teams should our sequestering with the plants that are solar powered that are powering our industry. Since you've been working so hard and you've got already $65 million, I need your help with that. But if you could answer that question, that'd be great.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks for asking that. It's same thing. It's really important. I'm glad you gave me the opportunity to clarify that. I think I mentioned it, but I probably didn't hammer it home enough that our focus on fuel standards as the way to value these practices is less about fuel and more about this is the way we get the numbers we need to incentivize these practices. The future, as I ended, is not about fuel standards and it's not about carbon. It's about water. But today, that's the market that's paying the most. And so we're going to use that to finance the additional practices that we need to do the things that are really important. Frankly, I don't care. I don't want to hear about New York being underwater. Doesn't make me any difference. Is my parents' house well at Lubbock going to go dry? I could give a crap about rising sea levels when there's house wells going dry in North Lubbock, when you got 500,000 homes in South Lubbock that won't sell because their house wells don't pump any water. Those are problems today that could get us. Those are problems that could destroy life in rural America as we know it. Those are the issues we have to really worry about. We are going to use, though, the fuel standards that pay more in order to finance the changes we need. Now, to your question, multidisciplinary approaches, I mean, those are going to be extremely important. And the good thing is think broadly, think outside of agriculture or sustainability, and think more, like I said, about ag productivity. How do we use satellite imagery? How do we overlay AgSense technology? How do we use AgSense to talk to variable rate technology, to talk back to the wells, to tell the wells to shut off when the pivot hits the stop in the middle of the night? You ever thought about how much water you're using? We deploy all this technology, and the pivot hits the stop at 2:30 in the morning. And if you don't go out there at 2:30 in the morning and shut that pivot off, what water are you really saving? You're really not saving any water. You're going to reverse that pivot, and it's going to come back around and put water back on a crop that doesn't need it. And so until you're having everything talking to each other and everything tied together, you're really not making any savings. So when you think about this stuff, think more broadly, more in terms of ag productivity and holistic approaches to things than just sustainability. And if we do that, if we drive at ag productivity instead, sustainability is going to be a natural outcome of our greater ag productivity, our greater ag profitability. And again, going back to my original comments, your families are going to be better off for it first and foremost. Does that answer your question?
Well, kind of.
No? Okay.
I have a point, and then I want to get back to my. So, I have a farm in New York, and I care about that. And even though I'm from here, right, I was raised in Bakersfield, California, and they're underwater. So, California does care about that, and I want to address those issues for them. But as someone who's based in Amarillo, Texas for the last 20 years, right, and who's representing the beef and the dairy industries, what I want to know through all your hard work and effort in working the USDA system, how do we build teams so we can, in this area, the Panhandle and the High Plains, establish the next generation of environmental standards, saying, wait a minute, Mr. Politician from New York or California, right? The cow does belch methane, right? We acknowledge that. But all that methane is derived from the grass that it eats, right? So the grass captured that carbon, by the way. So let's go back and look at, Dr. Prattle, let's look at what the cow is actually doing. So the cow belches, not farts, but farts or belches methane, right? And we're saying that causes greenhouse gas. All of that forage that we made with our perennial or annual grasses was sequestered, right, by photosynthesis, by the photosynthesis process. So, since you're already way ahead of my team on knowing those standards, my team has to catch up to you. And so, what I want to know, and we can talk about that over the beverage, but I want everyone to hear about it.
Thanks. I don't know if I repeated the question the first time. The question is, how do we control the narrative so that we're not one of these 66? Like, we're not one of these 66 countries around the globe that has some standard that we can't live up to. And I hear you. I've spent my entire career trying to be ahead of those modeling issues, trying to build bridges to the modeling teams in order to make sure the inputs to the model are in our favor, or at least don't kill us, rather than being completely against us and potentially destroying ag as we know it. And there are a number of key models. There are a number of key modelers that it is important to be in front of, and it is important to build bridges with, and not have animosity toward, and not go in defensive. Go in trying to figure out how you work together, because those models can hurt bad, and that's a really important thing, is driving good information into the models. So we'll take you up on that beverage. We should visit after, and we can talk more about those things. Anybody else? James?
That's a nice talk, John. Real quick question. Say the 100% effort. I would assume that sorghum is already one of the most climate-smart crops there is. We just need to demonstrate that and verify it. So as you look at splitting that 100% effort, how much of that is going to be just putting together the numbers and the verification to say what we're doing now is really meeting a lot of climate smart goals versus the overall improvement?
Yeah, no, that.
How much are we there and just need to show it versus how much do we have to change to get there?
Yeah, great question. Question was how much of our effort needs to be put toward telling the story of what we're already doing, and how much of our effort needs to be doing more. And I'd say, probably there's probably a good chunk of it that's just telling the story. I think we made the mistake in ag of assuming that it was all that, and we've gone into discussions with consumers positioned as we just need to tell our story better. And maybe that's true, but that's not really a message that's resonating with consumers at all. We need to show that we are trying to improve. And so that's why the data collection piece is so important. That's why using technology is so important, because if we use technology in that way, we're going to find the areas where we need to be more productive and efficient. There are areas, of course, we can all do better. But in areas where we can't, because we already are, then those are going to naturally fall out as well. And so when we think about technology and deploying technology and collecting data and doing it in a really, really granular way, that is going to get that job done either way. It's going to either show us that we had a bigger problem than we realized, or it's going to tell that story, and it's going to be with data, and nobody's going to be able to dispute it. And Rudy's like encroaching here, and I'm 10 minutes over, or 11 now. So you want to cut it off now? Or does anybody have any more questions? Yes, sir. Yeah, go ahead.
Do you have the ethanol industry? Are you going to market specific bushels or credits there? I understand, I guess most of your initial payments are coming out of the grant dollars, but are you planning to market specific bushels or premiums into the?
Yeah, question is what is the premium into California in the ethanol space, and are we going to market specifically for that? Our goal, one of many, of course, but one of our significant goals as a part of this is to develop a framework that will enable that. Right now, it's extremely difficult, if not impossible, to implement a practice on the farm, to sell it to an ethanol plant, to have that ethanol plant to go to California, and then for the money to come back through the supply chain to the farmer and fairly compensate them for their portion of that emissions reduction. Doesn't exist. That's what we're trying to build as a part of that. That's why the main non-farmer payment, the main bucket of funding that's not for the farmers and not for staffing to carry this thing out, is for data collection, because we're trying to build a framework to enable that. That way, anybody who wants to, any ethanol plants that want to participate and want to compensate the farmer for those practices are able to when this thing is over 5 years, and and 1 day from now. Okay, I'll be around. Catch me. Thank y'all.
Thank you.